Hello Internet and welcome back to Experimental Cataclysm, the show where we talk about recent changes to the experimental version of Cataclysm Dark Days Ahead. This is our first episode back after 0.G's release, so we do need to talk a little bit about logistics at the top of the show here. Now after a stable release, there's usually a lot of content that was sort of backed up and put on hold waiting for that release, and then when the stable drops, as 0.G did just a few weeks ago, these things start being merged. This means there's an awful lot of stuff that gets merged very rapidly, and this is pretty tough to talk about in a quick 10-minute video, and so I have to kind of pick and choose what makes it into the episode and what does not. Now I always prioritize new mechanics and content over bug fixes and balance, but ultimately it comes down to what I thought was interesting or a big deal or whatever, and additionally there were things being merged while this show was on hiatus. Now I kept track of them for a little while, but there were just very few pieces of content that were merged in that time, so I didn't think making a show about them was justified. Anyway, that's a long-winded way of me saying, hey, I'm just coming back from several months off and I'll be doing my best. It might not be perfect, I might miss some things, or your favorite change might not get talked about. It's not any kind of effort I'm not trying to slight anyone, it's just, it's me being bad at my job. With that though, let's get into the video proper. I will be a bit more brief than I usually am for each change, and it's just an effort to fit more stuff into the show, and it's probably going to be a lot longer than these videos usually are. So first up today from Carol, we have the addition of more skulls. Now I mostly mention this because skulls are pretty cool, and that's really the only reason I mention it. These included raccoons, possums, a couple of larger cats, bear skulls, and etc. There's really not a lot to it, and frankly they're not really valuable in any way. In my mind, it's more about building a collection than anything else. Next up from Little Shining Man, we've got the addition of several bungalows. Now, this actually started before 0.G, and we're basically just adding new house type locations to the game. I mention this just because it's continued to be merged after 0.G. I initially thought that these were just really old and had been waiting to be merged, but it looks like they're actually still making them and adding them right now. So yeah, way to stick it out there through stable and still come back and make more changes. Anyway, there's really not a lot to say here. We talked about these previously, I just wanted to point them out. Next up today, we have variants for skill books from Guardian DLL. This was a series of PRs that expanded skill books using the new variation system. I don't really remember if we talked about these or not, so the basic explanation is that variants are the same as their base item, but they have a different name or they have a different description. So for example, if we look at the Top Gear magazine, we can see that it can raise your vehicle skill up to level 1. At the top of the HHG website, we can see a line called AKA. This will show all variants that exist in the game for the item that you're currently looking at. So for example, you might instead find one that's called Motor Trend. It's the same exact thing. It will raise your vehicle skill to a maximum of level 1, but it will have a different name and a different description. Variations have been getting used more frequently and for multiple different things, and it's a nice little system that they added. For the skill books in particular, I suspect that some of you will be bothered by this. Most of us have memorized which skill books are valuable, which makes it really easy to sort through them in a library or wherever and quickly grab the important ones. However, with these new variations, we're going to have to learn which ones are which, and this is either going to involve you looking them up or reading through a whole mess of new books. Really, regardless, there were multiple PRs, there were 3 or 4 I believe, that expanded a bunch of the skill books. I did ask Guardian for a rough estimate of how many variants they added, and they said it was around 100, so that's kind of a lot. So next time that you're out exploring, you might want to take a second look at the book or magazine that you've never seen before. It might have some value. Next up, from Generic Dwarf, we've got a pair of sheet metal battle axes. Now this is one of those changes where I'm basically just saying, hey, look at this neat thing, so, hey, look at this neat thing. These are more uses for your sheet metal in the game, and it didn't even come from Aaron. These are called the welded Battleaxe and the bolted Battleaxe, and of course are both craftable by the player. So yeah, I don't know, go out there and try some of these sheet metal axes. Next up today from Kamayana, we've got a keybind for the prone movement mode. There are keybinds for each individual movement mode that allow the player to directly swap to that form of movement. The only one that was missing was for prone, so hooray, now you can set a button for prone. Next up today from C. Cavernous, we've got a makeshift welding blanket. Man, I feel bad for kind of rushing through these, but there's a lot of little things this week to talk about. Anyway, this is exactly what it sounds like. Previously, to make a welding kit, you needed a welding blanket. Well, now instead, you can craft a makeshift welding blanket, and hooray, that's taken care of. Next up today from Night, we've got an improvement to the crafting UI that will show negative effects. Basically, previously, if your crafting speed was penalized in some way, you would not have known that you were penalized and you wouldn't have known how badly. Now, in the top right portion of the crafting menu, there will be a line about penalties highlighted in yellow. So, for example, if you're wearing chitinous gauntlets, this line will tell you that your gloves are impairing your crafting and will display the overall percentage penalty that's being applied. And this is going to be helpful because I don't think that most players even realize that hand encumbrance could factor into this. This is overall a good change. More visibility for that sort of thing is pretty much an objectively good decision. Moving on, we've got a Polesaw from Bluarian Knight. This is, if you've never seen them, they're basically small chainsaws on a stick that they use to cut tree branches. Now, I personally dislike that this was added to the game. We removed the chainsaw Lajatang for being ridiculous and unwieldy, and yes, I know this is not the same thing as the Lajatang, and yes, these things do exist in real life. However, it's a gardening tool, it's not designed to be a weapon, and would just overall be a god-awful piece of crap. Chainsaws are not meant for cutting through, well, you know, like wet meat. It's a small landscaping chainsaw meant to cut tree limbs, not a giant chainsaw that they use to cut up sides of beef or whatever. Anyway, it is flimsy and overall a pretty bad weapon in the game. I just dislike it on principle. It seems like a meme thing to me. After some comments in the PR, the damage did get reined in a bit, and like I said, overall it's just not very good as a weapon. Anyway, hit me up in the comments, tell me why I'm wrong, and this thing is amazing. Go ahead, nerds. All you Reddit users probably love this thing. Next up today from Terminator, we've got a new weapon flag for you martial arts users. Basically, if your martial art allows you to block blows using your body parts, this would normally not happen if you were wielding a weapon. However, some small weapons will now have a flag that means you can still block when you're wielding them. Now, as I always point out, I'm not really a martial arts user in this game, so I don't know how much of an impact this will actually have on your playthrough, but I assume this is probably pretty great news. Anyway, moving on, next up from Ashclaw, we've got the ability to think to yourself. Basically, you can now think things that will then appear in the log. Now, for most of you, you probably don't care about this and you're probably not going to use it. However, I had entertained the idea of doing a roleplay at one point and was disappointed to find that there was no way, even with the debug menu, to simply print something in the log. This will now give you that ability, at least to some extent. So for those of you wanting to roleplay, this is a new tool in your toolbox. You do this through the NPC chat menu, the same way that you would have shouted something previously. Unfortunately, it is still somewhat limited because each line will include the phrase "you think" at the start of the sentence. Anyway, I found this pretty interesting, so there you go. Moving on now, from another Sea White, we've got a change that makes shockers create noise. This is done using the parrot command and will produce crackling or humming sounds. Obviously, they always made noise when they were smashing furniture or similar things that all zombies are doing, but now they actually have dedicated sounds that will telegraph a shocker zombie nearby. This is pretty self-explanatory, and there's nothing else in the game that crackles or makes humming noises, so it should be a distinct and clear indicator that you're dealing with a shocker zombie. Next up, from a name I don't know how to say, we've got a prompt before lighting fires. Basically, if you're like me, you've probably done this before. You go to start a fire in your brazier or fireplace or whatever and accidentally start a fire on the pile of clothing next to it. And just like that, your base is on fire, you panic, you die of smoke inhalation, and then you save scum to before all of that happened. Right, well anyway, this PR now adds a prompt for that situation. If you attempt to set a tile on fire that is next to your fireplace, it will give you a chance to, not do that. It is simple, it's straightforward, and it was made for people like me. Next up today, we've got our first sort of big important thing. This is from Mail Clips, and it addresses zombie scent tracking. Now, I'm sure most of you know, but zombies track players using 3 main senses, and one of them is scent. I've covered this in tutorials and blah blah, how it works, etc. Anyway, pretty much every zombie in the game was able to smell you. There was also a special flag for like super scent, which allowed some creatures to track you extremely well. Things like a wolf, for example. Now, scent in general is a really powerful tool for enemies to track you, especially when you're lurking around in the dark. However, there was no real variation to this. Like I said, basically everything could track by scent. However, now Mail Clips has gone through and assessed which zombies should have scent tracking and which should not. This involved removing it from some creatures and adjusting like which have the keen nose flag and etc, etc. I'm not going to run over the entire list. It was a lot of adjustments, but this has the potential to make a real impact on your game. Additionally, based on what was said in the PR, there will probably be follow-up changes made to other creatures as well. This one focused specifically on zombies, but plenty of other things in the game use that system. And of course, this is probably one of those things that's going to be dialed in more over time. Just because a change was made to a specific creature, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the best option or that it's going to stay that way. So yeah, something to be aware of. It has the potential to majorly affect things like night raiding, and we're just going to have to see how that all shakes out. Next up today from MNG Cataclysm, we have reputation-based events. Specifically, from what I saw, these are all negative reputation events. And this is something like you would see in like Fallout, for example. You piss off a faction and then they send some goons after you because you slighted the powder gangers or whatever. Now, I'm not going to cover these in detail because I think it's more fun to just let them happen to you organically. Most of us don't actually make enemies of the major factions anyway, so this probably is not going to happen for the average player. Each faction has different events that are attached to them, and yeah, that's about all I'm going to say about it probably. It's a neat idea though, it's an interesting addition for sure. Lots of games have this feature. Next up today from Lovum, we've got an update to the resort location. Now, I've never been a huge fan of this area, mostly because of the horrible monster density, and as a result, I don't really frequently use that start or go to this place or anything like that. Every time I hear the word resort, or earlier we talked about bungalows, whenever I hear those two words, it makes me think of Dead Island, and I kind of want to play that again. But anyway, some of this PR was like behind the scenes type stuff. They organized the files, optimized it with a palette, things that you probably don't care about. However, there were also changes to the map layout itself, and that includes expansion and collapsing or rearranging various locations within the resort. Now, I'm not really sure how expansive it truly is. I don't really remember what it used to look like. However, this might be enough for you to go back and replay that scenario if that's something that interests you. And then next up here today, I've got a change from Aaron related to practice recipes. I didn't get a chance to look into this. I missed it initially, and this video is kind of getting down to the deadline where it needs to go up on the channel, so forgive me once again for being brief. In simple terms, to my understanding, this moves more advanced melee training practice recipes from being auto-learned to appearing in books. My knee-jerk opinion initially was that practice recipes are intended for when you don't have a book, and so this didn't really make sense. However, that's not really true. Practice recipes are for practical skill instead of theoretical skill, and so my initial concern really doesn't apply here. You may find this inconvenient, but that is sort of the point. It was previously too generous. Before, you could pretty easily bang out a skill level of 3 with just auto-learned practice recipes, and again, that was just a little too generous. Now you can get to skill level 1 in most things with practice, but without a book you don't even know enough about the combat techniques, so you wouldn't really know how to practice efficiently to gain more advanced skills. So yeah, melee, unarmed, and dodge can be trained straight away to level 1, but higher tier practice recipes will require you to find a book with those recipes. Next up today from Kamayana, we've got a fix or update to the Advanced Inventory Manager. Now, to skip all the behind the scenes stuff and just be really straightforward, basically this made it so that containers now work better with AIM. Previously, it would only let you move one item at a time, and it interacted weird with like liquid containers and blah blah, etc. But now you should be able to target, like let's say a backpack, and hit the move all button to move everything from one panel into the pack, which is something that didn't work previously. And yeah, there is some nuance to this. I'm not really going to get into it. Basically, it's just a nice little improvement to the otherwise very old and janky AIM code. Next up today from Lyle SY, we've got a rework to wilderness spawns. If you've played the game for any length of time recently, you probably noticed that we have a lot of mutated animals on day 1. Now, to me, the two main aspects for like game stuff, it boils down to realism and game balance. Realism is a stated tenet of development for this game, and game balance is important because, it's a game and it should be balanced. And then many of these mutated animals were crazy, out of control powerful compared to the zombies that spawned at the same time frame, so it just didn't really track with game balance. The main takeaway here is very simple and boils down to one line in this PR, and I'm just going to quote this here: Day 1 forest spawns are now only living unmutated animals and harmless mutant insects. That becomes much less true over time. And so that's what I took away from this PR. This is something that's been out of whack for a really long time and hopefully will now be somewhat resolved. I didn't really dig into the specifics too much. I'm just glad that someone took a look at this. It's something we in the community have talked about for a while with mutated insects being out of control. And there is a comment in this PR that says this buffed insect spawns. I don't really know if that's true or not. I don't really know why they would have been buffed. If anything, they should have been nerfed somewhat. Insects were by far the thing that was the most out of balance previously, and the insects people have added are sometimes insanely powerful for really no reason. So anyway, I'm hopeful that this was a comment like before the PR really took off and was updated. I wasn't following it as it developed. But anyway, yeah, I'm hopeful that this reined in mutated animal spawns to be, less ridiculous. Next up today from A Noob in Disguise, we've got a change that I don't really understand because I'm a big stupid. This was a change to BMI and the penalties for being obese. What I do know is that previously being underweight was much more punishing than being overweight. If you got down to emaciated, you would suffer a severe speed penalty as well as penalties to your attributes. Being super overweight, if I recall correctly, only penalized you by capping your health in the negative. And don't get me wrong, that was bad, but for most of Cataclysm's history, health was a very easily manipulated stat that it wasn't a huge penalty. Basically what I'm saying is I would have rather had that negative 100 penalty to my health over a negative 3 to my strength stat. Anyway, this PR sought to make being overweight just a little bit more punishing and change how BMI is calculated. And that, unfortunately, is basically all I know about this. I tried reading it, internet, really I did. But it's like 2 full pages of text and like 40 commits, and I have a big smooth brain, and it just didn't really work out. It looks like having a high BMI will now introduce encumbrance penalties to your character. It also seems to apply extra warmth to certain body parts, like the ones that make sense. Obviously, like your eyes are not going to get like super sweaty because you're overweight. And initially, I disliked the warmth penalty, didn't really make sense to me, but people, kind of showed me some documents and said it was based in fact, so whatever. It looks like it caps out at a plus 15 warmth, which to me seems huge, but whatever, it's fine. Anyway, as I said, I'm like, I don't know, most of this PR was talk about how BMI is calculated and different BMIs based on muscle and fat and etc. It overall was just stuff that made my eyes glaze over, so it is what it is. I did ask some people to help me understand it, but it didn't really go anywhere, so this is the best I can offer. Sorry about that. And then finally today in this obscenely long video, we've got a boss creature from Bombastic Slags. Now because of spoilers, I'm not going to be covering this in detail, but basically there's a boss type creature in the physics lab, which is something we talked about briefly before if I recall correctly. There are some corpses in the area with loot, and the boss itself drops a unique weapon that, as far as I know, is not found anywhere else in the game. It also uses EOCs to spice things up and make it a unique encounter. Now if you don't know what EOCs are, that's okay. It's basically just a form of scripting, I think. And the idea here being that most of the time creatures in this game just have high stats and that's what makes them dangerous. But with EOCs we can actually do interesting things instead of just making a really buff enemy. But anyway, that's about all I'm going to say about this since it's pretty unique and is probably better for you to experience organically. With that though, I think that's the end of the show. Again, apologies for being so brief with so many topics. There were just a lot of smaller things I wanted to cover. And look, it's my first one back. I feel hoarse. I feel like maybe I didn't do a great recording here, so we'll see how that all turns out in the end. But I'll be back in 2 weeks or so with another episode in this series. Everyone, thank you for watching. Hopefully you're having a good time since 0.G released. And yeah, I'll be back in a couple weeks. I'll see you next time.